Population Biology and Human Populations Part 3 will take a new look at the factors that regulate the growth of populations, and that will lead us to examine a theoretical concept around species life histories known as R and K selection theory. The significant ideas are populations change and respond to interactions with the environment, and secondly, any system has a carrying capacity for a given species. Here is the outline of all the available movies for the Population Biology and Human Populations unit. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused here. Remember, population growth rate is a function of both natural increase rate and the size of the population. In the earliest stages, the population growth rate is small because n is small. In any case, with a small n, natural increase rate is at a maximum as resources are abundant and predators are few. As the population grows and n gets bigger, the population growth rate increases. Through the red portion of the curve, we have exponential growth. As the population's density gets larger, environmental resistance comes to play, and the natural increase rate declines, and the population growth rate slows. At carrying capacity, n is large, but the natural increase rate is approaching zero because of the density-dependent limiting factors. Thus, population growth rate is also approximately zero. Through the J-shaped portion of the curve, numbers in the population are small, so predators are few, disease is not easily spread, and resources are effectively unlimited. All the biological factors that allow the population to reproduce at maximum are in place. This is the biotic maximum. Thus, natural increase rate through the earliest portion of the J-shaped curve is at a maximum. As the population increases in size, density-dependent limiting factors begin to resist continued growth of the population, and the population growth rate approaches zero. Remember that natural increase rate is calculated using crude birth rates and death rates. Immigration and emigration could be used if the data is available. Remember that there is a decimal form of natural increase rate, and there is the percent form of the natural increase rate. You need to be comfortable with both. Once again, the J-shaped portion of the curve has the natural increase rate at a maximum because this is where the species is reproducing at its biotic maximum as a result of unlimited resources and few predators. Once the population grows in size, density-dependent factors begin to limit the growth, and the natural increase rate, while still positive through here, is getting smaller through here, and environmental resistance keeps the population at or below carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is known as K. So here is a way of seeing the natural increase rate through the changes in the size of the population. Through here, R is at a maximum, and then R gets smaller as the population grows. This should make sense. Density-dependent limiting factors such as predators, reduced food supply, disease, waste buildup impact both birth rates and death rates, both of which are involved in the calculation of natural increase rate. So here are the density-dependent limiting factors that limit the growth of populations as they approach carrying capacity. These factors keep the size of populations at or below carrying capacity. The growth in a population slows because these factors result in a decline of the natural increase rate toward zero as the population approaches carrying capacity. You should study this list. In addition to the density-dependent limiting factors, there are density-independent factors. The density-independent factors limit population growth regardless of the size of the population. Droughts, floods, hurricanes will reduce the size of a population, no matter whether the population is 1,000 or 1,000,000. In case you need evidence to support the existence of density-dependent limiting factors, you can see in this graph that as the density of birds increases, the number of eggs laid by the birds decreases. This suggests that more birds reduces the available food supply, thus limiting the number of eggs that are laid. In this graph, you can see as the density of plants increases, the number of seeds produced by the plants decreases. Again, we might hypothesize that as the density of plants increase, there would be less nutrients, water, or light available to all of the plants, so the number of seeds they produce declines. Malthus, in the late 1700s, suggested that while human populations increased exponentially, food supply would not be able to keep up, as food supply increases arithmetically as a function of the amount of available land. Malthus speculated that limited food supplies would limit human population size. Malthus suggested that limits to growth were environmental or biological. Interestingly, we now know that limited food supplies do not just result from the limited land capacity, as Malthus had speculated. Many human populations do not have enough food because of poor distribution or because they cannot afford the price. Boserup from Denmark suggested in the 1960s that as human populations increased in size, technological innovation would maintain pace to provide food. Boserup was technocentric, an optimist, a cornucopian. Boserup's theory was that with more people, there would be more demand, there would be change and innovation, and more production of food. Agriculture becomes more intensive in order to produce more food. In Boserup's mind, the limits were technological, not biological. Agricultural output might increase, but if the practices are too intensive, then they might not be sustainable. It's one thing to grow more food, but if the agricultural practices degrade the environment, then the practice is not sustainable. Interestingly, if one were to ignore environmental degradation, Boserup's theory has held up. Over the past 100 years, food supply has kept pace with human population growth, and globalization has allowed populations everywhere to grow. But what about the environmental degradation and the law of diminishing returns? Technological innovation may increase food supplies, but if we don't account for pollution and the degradation of soil, if human societies overexploit, then population crashes might yet occur. And also consider how location, in other words, the regional biome, might or might not provide resources for growing populations of people. A desert biome cannot support as many people as a wet tropical biome. As we return to basics, here is the IB syllabus statement. Describe the role of density-dependent and independent factors in the regulation of populations. And with an understanding of density-dependent and independent factors, we need to examine the meaning of the terms internal and external factors as regulators of population growth. Stay tuned. Natural increase rate is influenced by the clutch size of the species. How many eggs are in the average reproductive episode? Frogs lay thousands, while gorillas have one. Natural increase rate is influenced by the reproductive age, the age of maturity. Fruit flies reach maturity after a few hours, while elephants reach maturity after 10 years of age. Natural increase rate is influenced by the number of reproductive episodes. Annual plants have one episode, while trees produce seeds every single year. Natural increase rate is influenced by the size of the breeding territory. Some species can defend huge areas to support their needs, like the tiger, while others cannot defend such large areas. And lastly, natural increase rate is influenced by the degree of parental care. Some species lay their eggs and never return to care for their offspring, such as jellyfishes, while other species care for their young for many, many years. Now, these are the biological or internal factors that influence the size of the natural increase rate for a population. So, The factors that regulate the natural increase rate and thus population growth are the internal or biological factors: clutch size, reproductive age of maturity, reproductive episodes, the size of the breeding territory, and parental care, and those factors that I've already introduced you to, the external factors, the density-dependent factors such as predation, disease, buildup of waste, availability of food, light, nutrients, etc., and the density-independent factors such as weather, climate, hurricanes, volcanic eruptions, droughts, and floods. As a term, external factor is just another phrase for the combination of density-dependent and independent factors. So here is a slide with the internal or biological factors that influence the natural increase rate. For biological success, it would be ideal to maximize all of these factors. Huge numbers of eggs, early age of reproductive maturity, many reproductive episodes, huge breeding territory, and lots of parental care. Now imagine the size of the natural increase rate if that were possible. But it's not possible because the energy required by a parent to do all of these things is really not available. In other words, can you imagine a 6-month-old parent producing 1,000 offspring several times a year? Thus, over evolutionary time, lots of time, species have evolved to take advantage of one or the other strategy, either high reproductive rates or high survival rates. Let me explain. Stay tuned. So, for example, a species could put a lot of energy into coming to reproductive age early, having huge numbers of offspring, but could not have many reproductive episodes or could not provide much parental care. This is the reproductive approach. Or a species could come to reproductive maturity late and have just a few offspring, but could provide lots of parental care and repeat the process again next year. So it's not energetically possible to invest in all of the internal factors at the same time. So ecologists have a theory that relates to the evolution of species with respect to the internal factors regulating population growth. Stay tuned. And the theory is the R-K selection theory. Life histories that have become different over evolutionary time. We have the R strategists that invest in reproductive effort, and we have the K strategists that invest in survival effort. The life histories, the strategies of species, reflect the tension that exists between the reproductive effort and the survival effort. Thus, we have the R strategists with high natural increase rate, putting a lot of energy into the reproductive effort. We have the K strategists, which have a low natural increase rate, live around carrying capacity, putting a lot of energy into their survival over the long term. And now maybe you can understand where the use of the R and K come from, having studied aspects of R and K species when we studied succession. So here's a relevant IB syllabus statement. R and K strategist species have reproductive strategies that are better adapted to pioneer and climax communities, respectively. R selected species live a boom-bust lifestyle with exponential growth followed by a population crash, while K selected species live in a stable environment with population size maintained around carrying capacity. Once again, the R selected species live a boom-bust lifestyle with exponential growth followed by a population crash, while K selected species live in a stable environment with population size maintained around carrying capacity. Here's the relevant IB syllabus statement. Distinguish the roles of R and K selected species in succession. So here is the theory on ecological life strategies, ecological life histories. The R strategists are species that tend to spread their reproductive investment among a large number of offspring so that they are well adapted to colonize new habitats rapidly, make opportunistic use of short-lived resources. The K strategists are species that tend to concentrate their reproductive investment in a small number of offspring, thus increasing their survival rate and adapting them for living in the long-term Climax communities. So here are the characteristics of R and K species. I've presented this information to you earlier in this course. It's important that you stop the movie now and spend some time to study this slide. Consider the life strategy differences among the community's early and late succession. R-selected species, such as annuals, are poor competitors, thriving early in succession in an unstable habitat. The population grows rapidly but is soon replaced. The K-selected species, such as perennials, are good competitors, living in a stable habitat with their population maintained around carrying capacity. You should be able to name specific species in the successional sequence of communities. Here are additional characteristics of the early successional R-selected species and the late successional K-selected species. These characteristics should be familiar to you. Stop this movie and study the slide. Here again are additional characteristics of R-selected and K-selected species. Keep in mind that RK selection theory is an ecological theory. Not all species fit nicely into one or the other of the RK divide. But as a theory, it does help us understand what we see in nature. Here is a review of the changes in communities through succession. You should recognize changes in diversity through succession, or niche specialization through succession, or community structure through succession. You can now add to this change in the life strategies of species, R-selected species as colonizers, and K-selected species as climax species. Here is an R strategist. Thousands of offspring, and once laid, the adults will provide no parental care. Here is a graph displaying the boom-bust strategy of the R-selected species Daphnia. R-selected species are regulated more by density-independent factors than density-dependent factors, as they live on the J-shaped portion of the curve. Here is a K-strategist species, one offspring, with a high degree of parental care. Here is a graph displaying the carrying capacity strategy of the K-selected mammal species. K-selected species are regulated more by density-dependent factors than density-independent factors, as they live around carrying capacity. Here is a graph with the lifestyle of both the R strategist and the K strategist. R strategists are poor competitors in an unstable environment and live a boom-bust lifestyle, while K strategists are good competitors in a stable environment and live around carrying capacity. This is an important slide to study, showing the general characteristics of R and K selected species. I've circled the internal factors, the biological factors. I've already mentioned the general environment favored by R and K selected species. I'd like to call your attention to mortality. Due to the high numbers of offspring, mortality is high among R selected species, while due to high parental care, mortality is low in the K selected species. And note the point on population size. Variable reflects the boom-bust lifestyle, and stable reflects life hovering around carrying capacity. The internal factors appear to vary according to the environment. In difficult environments, clutch size is high. Individuals come to reproductive maturity early, and they limit their reproductive episodes. And all of these strategies enhance species success in difficult environments where the probability of death is high. Now, stable environments will select over evolutionary time for species with producing fewer offspring, coming to reproductive maturity late, and having many reproductive episodes over longer periods of time. Can you see R and K selection theory embedded in a graph such as this one? I've come back to this IB syllabus statement in order to bring survivorship curves into play in this movie. And elements of survivorship curves will make sense given the RK selection theory as I've presented it so far. Describe the principles associated with survivorship curves, including R and K strategists. Survivorship curves show the number of survivors in the population on the y-axis against lifespan on the x-axis. Now, I need to be clear about the x-axis. It is a time unit, but it is not the same scale for each species. The use of relative age here is a nice way to present it. For a fruit fly, the x-axis would be scaled in weeks, while for the elephant, the x-axis would be scaled over 100 years. Also, the y-axis can be presented in a standard scale 1 to 1,000, or in log format like this one, 1, 10, 100, 1,000. Be careful as you examine the scales of survivorship curves. In class, I will be working more with you on this point. So I've asked the question here, which species display the R-selected characteristic in terms of survivorship, or the K-selected characteristics in terms of survivorship? Now, the oyster is a type 3 or R-selected species. High mortality early in life due to the hundreds or thousands of offspring and the lack of parental care. Once the young oyster reaches a certain age, possibly grows a shell, it lives a full lifetime. Now, the human, or any large mammal for that matter, is a type 1 or the K strategist. K strategists survive well early in life due to high parental care and live a long life, but ultimately reach a biological death. And there are species that, in terms of survivorship curves, fit neither the R or K selection pattern. In this case, type 2, and this is the hydra, otherwise known as a jellyfish. Here's another set of survivorship curves, log scale on the y-axis, and this allows for a clean display of high numbers and allows to see with clarity the mortality of the type 2 across the lifespan. First, you can see the species represented by each type. Type 3 are selected oysters and type 1 K-selected humans. For the type 2, the survivorship curve shows that mortality is not age-dependent. It's an equal chance of death at any point in the lifespan. A log scale y-axis will display a straight line for the type 2 species if this is the case. Keep this in mind. So let's see if you followed my point on the last slide, because here is a graph where the y-axis is not log scale. Take a look at the type 2 curve. The chance of mortality is the same at each point in the lifespan. And this is what the curve looks like in standard form, non-log form. Thus, type 3 curves look like this in the non-log y-axis. Be careful. Here is one last set of survivorship curves. Note the log scale on the y-axis and the straight line for type 2 species. Spend some time with this slide to review survivorship curves and their relationship to R-K selected species. So here's a chance to review. You can turn the movie off now and practice, or you can follow along with me. The curve that represents the K-selected species is this type 1 curve. The R-selected species is this type 3 curve. Note that this is a log scale. Curve 2 is a straight line when the y-axis is scaled in log form, but if graphed using percent or actual numbers, we would see that type 2 would look like this, and type 3 would look like that. One last slide that may help you organize your thoughts. The internal or biological factors influence crude birth rates mostly. These internal factors could be called biotic potential, and you know what they are. The external factors influence both crude birth rates and crude death rates. External factors could also be called environmental resistance, and these are the density-dependent limiting factors as well as the density-independent factors such as weather and volcanic eruptions. The chart here displays R and K type species on a continuum in terms of egg production and parental care. The R species produce many eggs and display low parental care, while the K species produce very few eggs but display high parental care for the offspring that they do have. Study this slide carefully and see if you understand all that it has to say about R and K selected species. And that brings us to the end of Population Biology and Human Populations, Part 3.